Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Hereditary. Now, Hereditary is a supernatural horror film which came out last year, 2018, and this was actually one of my top 5 favorite films to come out last year, and it was also my favorite horror film of last year. Even though 2018 actually had quite a few really good horror films, like you had Mandy come out last year, you also had the remake of Suspiria and Annihilation and The House That Jack Built, even though some people might argue that one isn't a horror film, being that I have kind of a wider definition of what constitutes as horror, I could count The House That Jack Built as a horror film. Now, Hereditary was written and directed by Ari Aster, and Ari Aster has said that the 2 films that influenced him the most were Brian De Palma's Carrie and The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover. However, I also saw some elements of Stephen King's Pet Sematary in this movie, because this is also a story that very much deals with grief and loss and regret. There are also some elements of Rosemary's Baby and Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Now, for me, what really works about Hereditary is it's not just a horror film, it's very much a drama film as well, and for me, the best kinds of horror films are the ones that also work as dramas. Now, don't get me wrong, I do like cheesy horror films as well, but I do prefer the horror films that are taking themselves a little more seriously and are a lot more psychological. And what works about this is very much a domestic drama. It's the story of the breakdown of a family. Now, I'm gonna try to be as spoiler-free as possible in this review, however, that's gonna be very hard given this movie, and I might end up giving away what could be considered minor spoilers. Now, the plot of Hereditary is it follows this family called the Grahams. You have Annie and Steve Graham, the wife and husband, their teenage son Peter, and their 13-year-old daughter Charlie, who is a very strange little girl. Now, in the beginning of the film, Annie's mother dies, and Charlie really was the one who was closest to her. And as the film goes on, you learn that Annie had, honestly, a pretty fucked up relationship with her mother, and there were a lot of strange things that happened relating to her mother. Now, this might be considered a spoiler, but eventually in the movie, this family suffers another, arguably even greater tragedy. And as the film goes on, you see this family coping with this loss, but they start to get haunted by something. You're not sure if it's the ghost of this loved one, or if it's something else. Something possibly even demonic. And as the movie progresses, you start to realize that the lives of this family are being controlled and manipulated by something ancient and evil. And that's really all I want to say about the plotline of Hereditary. Now, in the film, Toni Collette plays Annie, and it's such a riveting performance. And you really do feel her grief and her sense of loss, and even though she is sympathetic, there are points in this movie where she's actually really threatening. In the movie you have Alex Wolff as Peter, and this is another great performance, and Peter is a character, like in the beginning of the film, he's kind of just a dumb kid, like he's a slacker, and he's a stoner, and I think we all knew that kid in high school, or maybe we all were that kid in high school. Now, this is a spoiler, but this tragedy that the family suffers is Peter's fault. It was an accident, but it's still his fault, and you feel him racked with guilt throughout this movie. Like, I know if I were in Peter's position, I would not be a functional human being, because I know there's no way I would be able to live with myself if I did what Peter did, even if it was an accident. In the movie you have Gabriel Byrne as Steve Graham, the father in the family, and he also gives a great performance. A little subdued compared to the other performances, but for the character that works. Now, the movie does fall into a cliche that normally gets on my nerves with these kinds of movies, where if a family's being haunted by something, it usually is the husband who's the skeptic, and that cliche really does sort of get on my nerves, but here it actually works very, very well. In the movie, Millie Shapiro plays Charlie, and for a child actress, she gives a hell of a performance in this movie. Like, she really does inhabit this role. And Charlie is a really interesting character, and she is sympathetic despite how weird she is. In the movie, Dowd plays Joan, who is this woman that Annie meets, and at first she comes off as this very warm and inviting person, but there are some very interesting revelations about her character throughout this movie. And all the acting in this movie is great across the board, and it's the characters that really make this movie work and really sort of ground this movie. And there are some very shocking scenes in this film. And what also really works about this movie is, despite being a supernatural film, it very much feels grounded in reality. Like, it feels like it could be set in the real world, which makes you buy the supernatural stuff even more. I mean, it feels very reality-based for the most part, however, there are some shots in this movie that are very much embracing the artifice of filmmaking. Like, in the film, Annie is making miniatures of her entire town, including her house, and there's certain shots in this movie that are obviously done with computer effects and stuff that make it look like the characters themselves are within the small house that Annie is making. So, while the film feels reality-based for the most part, there are moments in the film where the world that these characters inhabit feels very artificial. It's an interesting contrast, but it really does give you this sense that these characters, their lives are being controlled by something else. And I think fate is a major theme within this movie, but what this movie's saying is that fate is actually a really terrifying thing. Like, honestly, the whole idea of everything in your life being preordained by either God or the devil or just some higher force that we as humans could only just begin to understand, that's actually a really terrifying idea. And in this movie, you get this real sense that there really was nothing this family could do to stop what happened to them. Like, you really do get this idea that everything that happens to them in this movie was meant to happen. That they were not really in control of their own lives. Now, in the movie, there's this scene where in one of Peter's classes, they're reading a play, and one of the major themes in this play is fate. And it's actually very reminiscent of the classroom scene from the original Halloween. Now, I absolutely love the music in this movie, which was done by Colin Stetson, and in the final scene in this movie, the music they use is, I don't know any other way to describe it except pagan. Like, there's something almost pagan sounding about it, if that makes any sense at all, or like tribal. But it's an absolutely awesome musical cue, and if you've seen the movie, you probably know what music I'm talking about. But yeah, once again, Hereditary was an excellent horror drama film, and I'm really excited for this director's next movie, which is going to be called Midsummer, which is coming out this July. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Chris did on this movie. Be warned, there are some spoilers in his review.
So this is a polarizing one. People love it, people hate it. I get why people love it, and I get why people hate it. I'm very mixed on it myself. I kind of get what it's trying to say, but I think at the end of it all, it's very artsy for me. It's kind of a little bit too art house. It reminds me of The Witch, the Robert Eggers movie that came out not too long ago. And I like that movie more than this one. But yeah, this one was... I understand what it's trying to do, you know, and I do like some parts of it. I think what pissed a lot of people off was it was kind of misrepresented in marketing, because the trailers made it seem like the sister was going to sort of be the crux of the whole movie and kind of where everything emanated from. which is sort of true in some regards. But then you go and you actually see it, and she's in it for maybe 15, 20 minutes. I think that kind of threw people for a loop, and some people responded negatively to it. But I think the thing that I like was, okay, so basically you have this family drama, right? But then it turns out it all ends up in this big smack in the face, right? Where, okay, all this has been leading up to a big reveal of what all this has really been a cover for, and what the underlying plot of the movie has been. Sort of a family drama, more like a horror film disguised as a family drama. That crazy final sequence where you find out that, like, he's the boy king and he's the new vessel. It's kind of interesting, admittedly. I think there's a line when he goes to English class. I'm paraphrasing here. This ain't exact, but it was something like, the plight of the gods supersedes the plight of man. So the true horror of the film, I think, is that all this family drama that we got caught up in and became invested in meant absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. And it's a very scary idea, a very interesting one. A lot like Lovecraft. We're just like a tiny speck on the cosmological scale, and we don't really mean anything in the long run. Terrifying idea. There's a reason why it keeps coming back up in horror stories. So yeah, I enjoyed that aspect of it. That kind of like long con aspect of it. I mean, the title itself, when you think about it, is a lie. Because hereditary would imply blood, genetics, family, and then we get this big, slap in the face at the end that, no, it's actually been about this the whole time, but you were so focused on that aspect of it that you weren't paying attention to the smaller aspect of it. But then again, if you think about it, hereditary could also mean the reveal that Charlie is actually the vessel for this god, that he was the one who, it was sort of a destiny that was chosen for him, rather than him choosing it himself, and he was just the perfect vessel. That could also be what the title is trying to say, that he was just the perfect body for this entity. So I get what it's trying to say, but not one of my favorites on the whole. A lot like Mother. That was a movie that, okay, I get the themes here, but on the whole, it just ain't that strong a movie. But I will say that most first films that you watch, you're watching a filmmaker find their voice, right? Evil Dead was Raimi just trying to figure out sort of what he wanted to do as a filmmaker, the kind of stories he wanted to tell, the themes he wanted to explore, his kind of like visual prowess, all that stuff. You kind of see Ari doing that in this. He's got a great taste for, cinematography, for character, for dialogue, for plot, and the big surprise reveals. So I'm really looking forward to Midsommar. That's that next movie that he's working on. It looks very Stepford Wives, like somewhere between Stepford Wives and Wicker Man. That looks interesting. And if you kind of go through sort of the pantheon of filmmakers, a lot of them kind of started finding their voice in that second film they made. I'm excited to see what Ari kind of brings to the genre, because this movie shows a lot of promise, as much as a lot of people hate it and dismiss it. So, on the whole, pretty mixed on it. I can't say I recommend it, because it's definitely not a movie for everybody, but it's an interesting watch, I'll say that. Just go into it not really knowing what to expect. Try not to assume you know what this is right out of the gate, and just kind of go with the flow. Take what you can out of it, and just judge it on your own merits, or on its own merits. Ari shows a lot of promise, and I'm sure that he'll bring something very cool to filmmaking.